You're listening to the Unsiloed Podcast with Greg LeBlanc, produced by University FM. Unsiloed is a series of interdisciplinary conversations that inspire new ways of thinking about our world. So wherever you are, enjoy today's episode, and here's your host, Greg LeBlanc.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Saad, who is a professor both at Concordia University in Montreal and also on leave visiting Northwood University. And your position at Concordia, it's a little interesting. I mean, you're at the Molson School of Business, but you have a chair in behavioral consumption. I bet you're the only person on the planet that has that title, right?
Well, the official title is, by the way, I no longer hold it. I held it for 10 years, from 2008 to 2018. The official title was Concordia University Research Chair in Evolutionary Behavioral Sciences and Darwinian Consumption.
Darwinian Consumption, right? And also the author of a couple of books. I have two of them with me here. This one, The Consuming Instinct, What Juicy Burgers, Ferraris, Pornography, and Gift Giving Reveal About Human Nature. And I think this is preceded by a more academic book on Darwinian consumption. And then I guess it was in 2019 when you released this one, The Parasitic Mind, How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense. And you have another book that just came out last year, which unfortunately, I didn't get to. I'll ask you some questions about on happiness. And I'm guessing that one is flying off the shelf because everybody seems to want happiness. So first of all, welcome, God.
It's great to be with you. Thank you. I know that we've been going back and forth for a while to make this happen. So I'm glad to finally be on your show. Thank you for having me.
Well, look, I mean, you mentioned a story I think it was in The Parasitic Mind, when you talked about how you went and gave two talks at University of Michigan, same talk actually, to two different audiences. One was psychology and one was in the business school. And the talk was really about how you can use evolutionary biology and psychology to understand consumer behavior. And you said that in the psychology department, you got a warm reception. Everybody was asking you interesting scientific questions. And then when you went to the business school, you encountered a lot of resistance and people were not receptive to your ideas and very dismissive. And I think that if I were to make a prediction and you were to make a prediction, and I think David Buss in the introduction to your book made a prediction, we would have predicted that fast forward 10 years or so, the business schools would be more like the psychology departments and would have been more open to these ideas. But I think, strangely enough, we've actually seen the opposite in that business schools continue to be resistant to these ideas. And now psychology departments are resistant to these ideas. And this just seems particularly strange because going back, 100 years ago, was it Dobzhansky who said nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution? I mean, I've always thought nothing in the social sciences makes sense except in the light of evolution. And I remember it was 25 years ago, I started teaching a course in biology and economics, and it seemed relatively uncontroversial and kind of exciting and new at the time. But now I don't even think I could offer a course like that, even though I smuggle the material in most of my courses on behavioral finance and economics and so forth. So how do we explain this trend? It seems, well, first of all, we'll talk about the uses of evolutionary biology. And we can start by just saying, are you surprised by the kind of lack of adoption of these fairly obvious insights?
Well, I am surprised in that, frankly, it was my first exposure to what parasitized minds would look like. So, and I think offline before we started, you said that it pretty much, your evolution psychology work leading up to parasitic mind kind of captures the trajectory of your career. That is exactly right, because when I first finished my PhD and I was starting my first professorship, the goal was to Darwinize the business school. The idea being that you can't study anything involving any creature, let alone human beings in a business setting, whilst pretending that the biological forces that shape our behavior are somehow non-existent when we put on our consumer hat or our employer hat or our employee hat or our decision-making hat. How could it be that every other species on Earth, you would never dream of studying it void of its phylogenetic history, but human beings, yeah, of course, we're only a cultural animal. So that was, in a sense, my first exposure to how supposedly perfectly reasonable and educated people called professors, in most cases social scientists, in many cases housed in business schools, could completely have parasitic penchants. So in that sense, I had sort of a sense of epistemological indignation. How could you be such morons? Like, what could be controversial about the fact that hormones should affect our behaviors? Who wouldn't know that? Who wouldn't agree with that? So the next question would be, well, why is it that there is such an animus that social scientists, although in many cases, even natural scientists, will exhibit towards evolutionary psychology? And I say natural scientists because you take, for example, someone like Richard Lewontin and Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard. They were professional evolutionists. So it's not as though you needed to convince them that evolution was a veridical theory to explain speciation. But once you try to apply evolution to the study of this one species called human beings, well, then you're a quack, you're a Nazi, you're so on. And so in their case, it's because they were Marxists. So therefore, their ideological commitment did not allow them to afford the possibility that evolution could have shaped the human mind. So that was, if you like, a marriage that I just gave you between my evolutionary psychology work and then eventually writing The Parasitic Mind. Maybe I could mention just a few of the reasons why people have such animus towards evolutionary psychology, which exactly purports that evolutionary psychology and evolutionary biology should be applicable to every species, but that it transcends, human beings transcend those forces. Or it might explain why we have opposable thumbs, but surely don't use evolution to explain everything that's above the neck. Okay. In some cases, people could be a bit more flexible in saying, well, it explains very primal urges, why I want to eat a juicy burger, but it surely can't explain higher order reasoning. What do you mean? Where do you think our cognition comes from? And so even though I'm completely used to, at this point, facing all the animus, it still surprises me because to me, it should be banal and trivially obvious that, of course, evolutionary psychology explains our human behavior.
Well, look, I mean, there are two dimensions of resistance to it. One is just simply that folks like economists, they're just not interested in getting into the black box. So they'll just say, look, here are the preferences. Let's take preferences as given. And going into final causes, right? Let's just box that off, partition that, leave that to other people. And we're just going to focus on the decision making. We'll measure a demand curve and there it is. And let's not worry about it. Okay, that's one form of resistance. Then the other form of resistance is let's crack into the black box, but let's only use certain types of explanations or models. I mean, I think the first one is less important now. I think we've come around to the idea that interdisciplinary research is more acceptable.
Yeah. So I'll address both of those causes. Table for a second the first one, the economist one. There are additional forms of animus to evolutionary theory in general and evolutionary psychology in particular. So some people who succumb to sort of the fallacy of biological determinism think that if you somehow offer an evolutionary-based explanation for something, then you are just a passive executor of your genetic imperatives. Whereas, of course, we know that it's a complete interaction. Even genes are turned on or off as a function of environmental input. Other people hate evolutionary theory because they think that a whole bunch of really nasty folks have misused it. The Nazis, eugenicists, British social class elitists in the 19th century. And therefore, let's create a new worldview where biology ceases to matter, because then hopefully we can all sing Kumbaya and so on. And so there's a whole range of reasons, and I've only given you 3 or 4, but there's many more that explains that sort of visceral animus. But to your first point regarding the economist, there, I think the important distinction to make is the distinction between proximate explanations and ultimate explanations. Most, not just economists, most scientists of any ilk in any discipline operate at the proximate level, which is understanding the how and the what of a mechanism. Most Nobel Prizes are won in the proximate world. There's nothing wrong with that. The ultimate explanation is not ultimate in a superior sense. By the way, you mentioned earlier the animus I faced at the University of Michigan. One of the sources of the animus, amongst many others, was when I used the term ultimate as if I'm sort of epistemologically superior. I am giving you the ultimate explanation. That's not at all what it means. It means ultimate in the unfolding of the causal chain all the way to the ultimate Darwinian why. So if, for example, I tell you pregnancy sickness women experience this since time immemorial. It occurs in a very predictable way. It happens exactly during the period of organogenesis in the first trimester, where the organs are forming in utero. And there's a million proximate questions I can ask. If I were an OBGYN, how does the fluctuation of a woman's hormones affect the severity of her symptoms? Look, I use the word how. Or I could say, what are particular smells that might trigger pregnancy sickness? That's a what question. The ultimate Darwinian question is, why has that mechanism evolved? And the answer is a beautiful one. It's because it protects women during that very important period from potentially ingesting teratogens, foodborne pathogens that could wreak havoc during organogenesis on the forming organs in utero. Now, it turns out, from a practical perspective, if you go see your OBGYN because you're having these really unpleasant symptoms, he or she will give you a pill to try to reduce those symptoms. That is the perfectly incorrect thing to do from an evolutionary perspective, but because more pregnancy sickness symptoms results in a better outcome. There's less likelihood of miscarriage, better outcome of the child being born healthy, precisely because those unpleasant symptoms are an insurance protection mechanism. And so understanding any phenomenon at both levels of analyses, at the proximate and ultimate, offers you the possibility of fully understanding something. Economists, not only do they not care in what's happening inside the black box, as you said, even if they cared about what's happening in the black box, they would only care about it at the proximate level. So there's a wide range of interesting explanations that they are foregoing by not understanding that other level.
So for someone who's trying to make decisions, why do we care about the ultimate level? I mean, if I'm just interested in prediction, presumably I can just look at the empirical data and, look at variation and back out the predictions of what works and what doesn't work. So why would, say, a marketer be interested in understanding these underlying causes?
No, I got that. And I specifically try to address that when I'm teaching, say, MBAs, who many of them may not be there for intrinsic reasons. I just want to learn. But they go, every syllable, how can I monetize what you're saying, professor? And so I've got to give them the practical implications. A good marketer is one that is wedded to a solid understanding of human nature. So even if the marketer does not describe themselves as an evolutionary psychologist, by virtue of themselves being a walking Darwinian being, their marketing solutions will either be, all other things equal, effective or not, if they are wedded to an understanding of human nature. Now, that sounds all sort of unclear. So let me give a concrete example. If you want to understand female sexuality and female mate preferences, there is one consumatory product that you absolutely have to study, and it's called romance novels, because romance novels are almost exclusively read by women around the world. And the romance novel always has a male protagonist. That male protagonist borders, if you're using an AI system for plagiarism detection, it would be bordering on every single romance novel ever having been written, having plagiarized from some original romance novel, because it's the exact same guy. The guy is tall. The guy has a royal title. He's also a neurosurgeon. He also is very feckless in his risk-taking. He cannot be tamed except by the love of this one woman. He also wrestles alligators on his six-pack and comes out victorious. I just described every single romance novel. Now, there was a company, I can't remember the details, but that apparently was trying to create a new romance novel line. This is marketing, right? It's creation of a new product. And because they wanted to eradicate the toxic masculinity, because they wanted to create a new line of new male that women should be fantasizing about. Now, that's coming, linking it to parasitic mind, it's coming from a parasitic idea called social constructivism. Everything is due to social construction. We are born tabula rasa, and then it's socialization that makes me prefer the types of women I'm attracted to, or makes women prefer the types of guys they're attracted to. It's Hollywood images, it's Elle magazine, it's Beyonce videos. Of course, it's the exact opposite mechanism. Hollywood images exist in their form because they cater to evolved pensions, okay? So this particular group of marketers at this particular company had the wrong impression of human psychology, whereby they had the audacity to say, I will teach you what types of male you wish to fantasize over, because you're born tabula rasa. Well, it didn't go too well for them because women didn't say, you know what? Yes, if you tell me that I should be attracted to pear-shaped guys who have nasal voices and cry while sucking their thumbs because they're so sensitive while watching Bridget Jones' Diary, that was fair enough. Then that's what I will be attracted to. They said, no, sorry, that's not what I'm attracted to. And so that gives you a good example of a marketer who decides that based on their understanding of the human mind, they will create product lines. If it's not wedded to evolutionary psychology, it will fail.
But look, I mean, marketers know this stuff, even if they don't know why, they know the what. I mean, they've been doing this for decades. If you walk into a casino, there'll be a scantily clad woman dealing the cards. And this is not by accident. They figured it out. They know it works. They'll tell you sex sells, et cetera. They might not know anything about Darwinian evolution, but they seem to have figured it out. I mean, do market forces ultimately lead to effective discovery of these insights? I mean, what can we add when we bring in the theory?
I said at the start that a good marketer is one who, by virtue of them being a Darwinian being, already comes equipped with that knowledge. So exactly, but there is a countervailing force, and that is ideological capture, right? Hence parasitic mind, right? If you get other marketers who are parasitized with ideas that are contrary to human nature, then maybe it becomes valuable to read The Parasitic Mind and take Professor Saad's course, because we know that certainly within the ecosystem of the university campus, it is now questionable whether we know exactly what is male or female. We knew until about 15 minutes ago, the 117 billion people who had existed on Earth were able to completely navigate through the conundrum of what it is to be male or female. But now we no longer know, as the latest addition to the US Supreme Court explained to us. She's not a biologist. How could she know what is a woman? So you're right that most people come into the world and navigate the world with certainly a folk understanding of Darwinian principles. But that doesn't mean that there aren't unique insights that are gleaned from understanding those things. Let me give you a specific example. My first exposure to evolutionary psychology, Greg, was in my first semester as a doctoral student when I took a course in advanced social psychology with Professor Dennis Regan. And about halfway through the semester, he assigned a book called Homicide.
Daly and Wilson.
Daly and Wilson, look at you. Regrettably, Professor Wilson has passed away, but I think Martin Daly is still kicking out. I'm not sure how productive he is these days. They were a husband-wife team at McMaster University back then.
I met them both at HBS back in late 90s or something.
Oh, okay. Well, I mean, Daly and Wilson, in their book Homicide, discuss a wide range of patterns of criminality spanning across cultures and time periods, but that can very, very elegantly and parsimoniously explain these phenomena. So let's take one example, child abuse. And maybe you already know where I'm going with this, or maybe, but you do. Okay. Most people absolutely can't guess it. So when I tell people, can you please tell me what do you think is the number one predictor of child abuse? And people offer all sorts of explanations that some of them, there is a causal link. But whatever they come up with, and they never come up with the right answer, is 100-fold lesser than the most important factor, which is if there is a step parent in the home. Now, surely that has huge applicability in the sense that if I am a social scientist trying to develop ultimately downstream some public policy, knowing that singular factor has more predictive ability than all of the other factors that social scientists have come up with combined, there has to be some practical applicability beyond just, oh, it's an interesting scientific phenomenon. So again, rooting your understanding of human nature and subsequently the actionable outcomes of that knowledge has to be rooted in a correct understanding of human nature.
Well, I mean, it seems like so many of the challenges that we're encountering in academia stem from one of the most basic fallacies that goes all the way back to Hume, which is the failure to distinguish between the positive and the normative. I mean, we had a colleague who was teaching marketing who was basically fired for his job for discussing segmentation along gender lines. Now, look, you don't need to think it's a good thing or a bad thing. Maybe you want to ban it. Maybe you want to regulate it. That's a completely separate question as to whether or not you get lift, right, when you engage in the practice. So, I mean, are we essentially foreclosing these conversations simply because we don't like what we might imagine to be some normative implications, or because we just want to jump to the normative intent that we have? I mean, is that one of the key fallacies?
Yeah. So related to what you're saying, remember earlier I said there's a whole range of factors that causes the animus. So I'm going to mention one now that is not identical, but certainly linked to what you're saying about the difference between normative and so on, or naturalistic fallacy and so on. Oftentimes, when you use evolutionary theory to explain what are reprehensible behaviors, child abuse, domestic violence, infidelity in a marriage, infanticide, people immediately interpret that as justification for that reprehensible act. And therefore, oh, so you're saying that here's the reason why people cheat on each other. So you're saying it's okay because you have a scientific explanation? Oh, so you're giving a justification for why child abuse happens because it's a step-parent, which of course has the same level of intellectual acuity than as saying, if I'm an oncologist and I explain cancer, that means I'm justifying it. I'm pro-cancer. I want to justify its existence. It's silly. But now, there's a deeper reason why people hate evolutionary theory. I think it's because in many cases, it attacks people's most foundational ideological commitment. So if I'm a radical feminist, I hate evolutionary theory because you're arguing that there are innate sex differences due to sexual dimorphism. I don't like that. If I'm a postmodernist, I hate evolutionary psychology because it certainly purports that there are human universals as part of our shared biological heritage, whereas in postmodernism, there are no universal truths other than the one universal truth that there are no universal truths. If I am religiously minded, I don't like evolutionary theory because are you saying that all of the exquisite design in nature is not due to my preferred God, but it's due to some randomness? So for a wide variety of reasons, people agree on why evolutionary theory is truly a dangerous idea. Now, on the one hand, it's very frustrating for me because it doesn't matter how well I do my job in trying to convince people of the veracity of evolutionary theory and evolutionary psychology. There's a new generation of imbeciles that come up and that I have to now fight an ever-ending tsunami of the exact same counter arguments. But on the other hand, what's exciting about it is that I never have a dull day. In other words, there's almost nothing that I could ever say to anybody, whether they love what I'm saying or hate what I'm saying, where it goes unnoticed and people go yawn. I'm in the thick of things. I'm discussing ideas. So in that sense, I've made the right career choice, I suppose.
Well, look, this book, The Parasitic Mind, I mean, I think the title is a bit deceptive because when you turn your eyes to academia or to the scientific community and what ideas percolate to the top and which ones have trouble. And obviously, it's not just the scientific community, but the broader community. You actually offer up a couple of different theories. I mean, one is this idea of parasitism, but there are other ones that would suggest these ideas are not parasitical, but rather functional in some ways. So whether it's with respect to signaling one's loyalty to a group, which is clearly functional, similar to the way religion operates. You also talk about the sneaky fucker strategy and so forth. So, I mean, why did you focus on the title, just the parasitic hypothesis, rather than the symbiotic or functional hypothesis?
So as I was trying to come up with a very strong metaphor for why it is that human minds can be haplessly led to the abyss of infinite lunacy, I started scouring. One of the things you do as an evolutionist is you often will look at other species to draw homologies or analogies in the behavior. So for example, if you're trying to demonstrate the sex specificity of toy preferences, you might demonstrate that vervet monkeys, rhesus monkeys, and chimpanzees exhibit the exact same sex specificity of toy preferences, suggesting that it's probably not due to social construction. Okay. So in my case, I started scouring the literature and I came across the parasitology literature. But parasitology simply discusses host-parasite interactions, but the location of where the parasitism takes place doesn't have to be at the brain, right? So a tapeworm parasitizes your intestinal tract. Now, neuroparasitology is when the parasite looks to end up in the host's brain, altering its circuitry to then suit its benefit. Usually it's reproductive benefit. So for example, a wood cricket,
It negatively impacts the fitness of the host.
it does. I mean, to the point of killing it, right? So, and hence that's why I started using the word of it leads you to the abyss of infinite lunacy, because you are literally jumping into the abyss of infinite lunacy when some women have 9-inch penises, and letting in immigrants who are avowed to destroying your culture is perfectly fine because you're a kind and empathetic human being. So it not only literally could mean your death or the death of your civilization, but it certainly leads to the death of common sense, of reality, of logic, of science, of anything epistemological. So, but just to finish the point about wood cricket, the wood cricket abhors water, wants nothing to do with water. When it is parasitized by a hairworm, the hairworm needs the wood cricket to jump into water so that it can complete its reproductive cycle in water. And guess what the wood cricket does when it is parasitized? It jumps and commits suicide to the service of the parasite. And so that was my eureka moment. Aha, it's not mimetic. So I'm very careful in the book, if you remember or notice, I said, yes, I recognize how some people might think, oh, but isn't this just a meme? A meme doesn't have inherently a valence attached to it. A meme could be positive, it could be neutral, or it could be negative. But a neuroparasite has no benefit to the hapless wood cricket, right? So it's Queers for Palestine. How could that be? I mean, that's, by the way, there's a class of people, and of course I can say it because I'm Jewish. I hate that game, by the way, where only Black people can say the N-word and only Jews can say certain. No, anybody should be able to say anything. But in any case, I call them wood cricket Jews. Wood cricket Jews are Jews who are the first to line up to condemn Jews, to condemn Israel, to be pro-Hamas, to be pro-Gaza. They are so much more enlightened than people who operate in the earthly reality that the rest of us rubes operate. They transcend that. Therefore, they are queers for Palestine. They are Jews for Hamas. So yeah, there's a real strategic reason why I picked the neuroparasitological framework.
But look, the existence of these parasites it impacts the fitness of the host community, but it also impacts the relative fitness of the individual host. But there are other explanations which you allude to, like sexual selection, which as a whole, there's a huge deadweight loss, right, for the species. But for each of the individuals, it makes sense for them to play that game. So, I teach a course on behavioral finance, and we walk through all these things, hyperbolic discounting and framing and positional pursuit of status and so forth. And all those things are deemed irrational by economists. But when you view them through a biological lens, they make perfect sense. They're ecologically and biologically rational. So couldn't the social justice nonsense that you're referring to, couldn't this be individually rational for people to engage in?
So there may be individual fitness maximizing reasons why someone adopts some of this parasitic stuff. And as you alluded to earlier, and maybe some of the people may not have understood the term that you used. So sneaky fucker is a term that was introduced in the 70s in the zoological literature. The fancy term is kleptogamy, the stealing of mating opportunities. But sneaky fucker has a much nicer colloquial ring to it.
And it's frequency dependent. So it only works if you are in a minority or there's a certain percentage of the population engaging in this.
Exactly. But just to explain it in the animal kingdom, you may have two phenotypes of a male. There's kind of a prototypical dominant male with the classic secondary characteristics of masculine phenotype. But then you have another type of male that mimics how a female would look like. And so the dominant male sees the sneaky fucker, thinks it's a female, lets him through, and then he surreptitiously then engages in some copulatory acts while the dominant male thinks that he just let in another female in, right? And so I take that principle, which, by the way, to my earlier point about scouring the animal kingdom literature, I wouldn't have been able to come up with that link if I hadn't wedded myself to the animal literature. That's what's important about comparative psychology, studying the psychology and behavioral patterns of other species. And so that's when I had my eureka moment, right? I didn't come up with the term sneaky fucker, but I came up with the concept of male feminists as sneaky fuckers, right? And so the idea there is, I'm so sensitive, I cry when I put gas into my car because I know that the evil juice is resulted from the raping of Mother Earth. I really care about being vegan. I wear a foulard because I'm very, very sensitive. And hopefully by you having me around, I mean, to a female, then I appear as though I'm not threatening, and maybe that would let you put down your guard. I mean, not for me to sexually assault you, but to fall in your good graces. And so it's one of a multiplicity of strategies that men can use to try to get close to women. And so, to your point, in that singular case, me adopting that strategy has fitness maximizing. But certainly, there are no fitness maximizing benefits to this thing called science via the adoption of postmodernism. Because has postmodernism advanced anything of any value in science? No. Have we built better bridges? No. Have we solved cancer better? No. Have we developed better applied econometric models to study consumer choice? No. It's a nihilistic thing. It's intellectual terrorism. So I suppose whether it's fitness maximizing or not depends on who is the unit of analysis, but certainly on the epistemological level, it's pure shite, as we say.
Well, but another way to look at it is as a form of new religion. Religion didn't do much for the advancement of science, but it has plenty of other functional purposes, one could say. And so, I mean, as a young scientist myself, I was exposed to Popper and falsifiability criteria. I mean, this seemed to be an integral part of our education as grad students in most disciplines. Why is it that we continue to see people in academia who are at relatively high status universities who don't seem to be familiar with Popperian falsification and have sort of, I mean, do people just sort of have a blind spot? I mean, because so many of the things that you describe, they seem to be immune to any kind of falsification.
Yeah, so true. I agree with you that there should be required reading for all sorts of reasons. I would say, even if you're not a behavioral scientist or psychologist type, the Fisk and Campbell 1959 paper on multi-trait, multi-method matrix is a must. Another one that I would say is a must would be the 1971 paper by Davis titled "That's Interesting!" where he gives 12 criteria by which you could judge whether research is interesting. I mean, it's one thing for research to have internal and external validity. And most reviewers on academic journals will judge, did you control the right things? Did you tease out that it was due to this effect? Was the literature review adequate? Was the theoretical foundation appropriate? Did you use the right data analytic procedures? Okay, all that is important, of course, crucially important. But the final finding, do we care about it? Was it interesting? Is there any value to that? And I would argue that probably 70% of the time that I ever reviewed an academic paper, I've been now a professor 31 years, so that's a lot of papers, probably I could have taken the same cut and paste sentence where I say, great job on methodological rigor, blah, 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 but who gives a shit about this finding? So you found basically that customers who were satisfied with an establishment were more likely to return to this establishment. Holy shit, who could have ever imagined this? Who could have known this? But you used Liz-rule modeling and pathway, and used moderation media. So it walked like a duck, it quacked like a duck, it sounded sciencey, therefore it must have been sciencey. And in that sense, it was methodologically rigorous, but on a completely unimportant point. All this long-winded thing to say is that I support your point about, Popperian falsification and so on. And too many academics don't know any of this sort of philosophy of science stuff. But I want to explain what makes those parasitic ideas so alluring, because that kind of ties a couple of the threads that you've been asking about.
Right. This is, I think, this new discipline of, I guess, I don't know, mimetic parasitology. I think we actually ought to have a subfield in our psychology department. Right?
I love it.
The epidemiology of mind pathogens.
I agreed. But in any case, as I was writing The Parasitic Mind, I needed to make sure to at least cover, but why? How could anybody believe this? Like, what causes you to actually, you're not literally lobotomized. What could be alluring about this? And so here was the explanation, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on it. So I argue that each of these parasitic ideas starts off from a noble place. And let me give you a concrete example. Equity feminism is great. It says there should be no institutional barriers in terms of how you treat men and women. And so based on that metric, then most reasonable people say, yeah, sign me up. I'm an equity feminist. Then radical feminists come along and say, well, that's not enough. In order for us to squash the existing sexist patriarchy, we have to promulgate the idea that men and women are indistinguishable. So in the service of what started off as a noble goal, right, which is eradicate real sexism if it exists, if we have to murder and rape truth in the service of that noble goal, so be it. So, and that's how I then get into this distinction between deontological versus consequentialist ethics. Certain principles, freedom of speech, presumption of innocence, freedom of inquiry, defense of truth, have to be deontological. The second that you say, I believe, but, you say, but, you're an asshole, okay? There is no but. There is no but, right? Because then you fall into, I believe in presumption of innocence, but not for Brett Kavanaugh, because in his case, it's too important, the job that he's going to have. I believe in freedom of speech, but not for Donald Trump when he was kicked off Twitter. It doesn't apply to him. I believe in journalistic integrity, but not when it came to shutting down the Hunter Biden story and so on. So no, it has to be deontological. So each of these parasitic ideas actually starts from a noble place, and in the service of that really laudable, noble goal, if we have to rape truth, so be it. So transgender activism is exactly that. I went in front of the Canadian Senate in 2017. I mean, literally, you could go listen to it. I predicted everything that's happened. Okay, and I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back. It's just because you could clearly see what was coming down the pipeline. I said, look, I support the right of all people to live free of bigotry. So based on that metric, count me as a very socially liberal person. I'm pro-trans. On the other hand, if you ask me to murder and rape truth in the service of making a small minority live out their personhood better, then F you. No. So I can walk and chew gum at the same time. I believe that transgender people should be free of bigotry, but no, men cannot menstruate. So I think that is a broad explanation for why all of these parasitic ideas are so alluring.
But look, as someone who is schooled as an economist, we get utilitarianism through osmosis. And so from a utilitarian perspective, ideas and fact, they can cause pleasure, pain. And so it makes perfect sense that you might want to distribute falsehoods if it increases, welfare. Makes perfect sense. But I think you're suggesting that there's some kind of Trivers-like self-deception that kicks in. I mean, because you can imagine a world where people are like, well, of course, we all know that men and women are different, but we're going to say that they're not because we know that this will advance our goals. I think the number of people who do that is actually vanishingly small. I think that most of the people who say these things, they believe them. They just cannot believe something that is going to undermine their desire to advance the utilitarian goal that they have in mind. Why is that necessary? I mean, you wrote this book before the COVID epidemic, and there was a lot of discussion during the COVID epidemic about whether, as a public health official, you should tell the truth or say the thing which is going to yield the desired result. And I think long-term, you could see that there's been some negative consequences for embracing the utilitarian view. But I think that, the issue is real. Why is it that so few people can embrace the kind of cynical view?
So I hope that what I'm going to answer either in a direct or oblique way addresses your question. It's difficult to tell, and I've struggled with this question myself, how many of the parasitized people in the deepest recesses of their mind, when they put their head on the pillow, know that they're full of shit versus truly have internalized it, to your Trivers self-deception argument. And we can debate here what that number would be. I do think, for example, and I do mention that in the Parasitic Mind, that the French postmodernists, I absolutely believe that they knew that they were full of shit. I don't believe that Lacan and Derrida and so on said all those things thinking, gee, no, What actually, to our earlier point about sexual selection, I think that there is great power in me appearing up on top of the podium at Princeton with a bunch of really looking in awe at me, beautiful young students, and I start espousing gibberish. And then I look around and I say, people are taking this seriously and actually think I'm a prophet. Let's ride this baby all the way to the bank. And so I think, and by the way, Michel Foucault said that to John Sear, and I mentioned that exact interaction, that there's an element of full profundity bullshit that is part of the game. So notwithstanding what percentage of people truly have internalized the parasitic ideas versus simply signal it, we can debate that. I think to your more general question, The Parasitic Mind is a book on what happens to our cognitive system when it is parasitized. But that's why my next book is Suicidal Empathy, which is what happens to our emotional system when it is parasitized. You need the 1-2 punch to completely zombify me, because I am a thinking and feeling animal. So what happens to the people who say you can't, because you mentioned COVID, who say you can't go say goodbye to your dying grandmother because COVID is too important, but don't you worry about going with 100,000 people on top of each other at the BLM rally. As a matter of fact, 1,000 of us really important public health officials have signed the document. It's settled science. It won't spread through 100,000 people, but don't you dare say goodbye to grandma. It can't be that there isn't some kind of zombification that's taking place there. Now, in that case, I would argue, I mean, there is a cognitive parasitic element, but there is certainly a suicidal empathy element, which is it okay if I just get into the explanation of suicidal empathy? Because it's going to hopefully tie the whole thing together.
I might have to have you back when that book comes out, though.
Absolutely. I will commit right now on the record to coming back. But anyways, empathy is a wonderful emotion that there are very clear evolutionary reasons for why it has evolved. We are a social species. Being able to, certainly the cognitive element of empathy, having theory of mind is important. Affective empathy is also important. So there are very, very clear evolutionary arguments for why we would have evolved that. But as Aristotle explained to us 2,500 years ago, everything in the right amount, at the right place, right time, and so on. So what happens to empathy when it misfires, that's the whole point of the book, is akin to what happens with OCD. So OCD is the environmental threat scanning mechanism goes haywire. It makes perfect sense if I meet you at a cafe, you say, hey, God, how you doing? And you sneeze in your hand, and then you come out to shake my hand, that when you're not looking, because I don't want to offend you, I go to the bathroom and I wash my hands because it looks like Greg has got a bad flu and I don't want to catch it. But if I spend the next 8 hours locked into a repetitive behavior, cleaning my hands, and as the skin is falling off and I can't get to my work and I'm fired, well, now that becomes OCD. So what started off as a perfectly adaptive mechanism, when it misfires, in this case, it's hyperactive, it becomes maladaptive, it becomes a psychiatric dysfunction. Exact same principle, I argue, for empathy. Empathy is great when it is within the proper regulated zones and it is targeting the right people. But if for whatever reason, MS-13 gang member become more worthy of my empathy than American vets, then we have a problem. If it becomes incredibly important for me to be astoundingly empathetic towards one religion called Islam to the detriment of everyone else, we have a bad case of suicidal empathy. So what I argue in the book is that much of the disasters that we are seeing, both in domestic policy and foreign policy, at least when it comes from the progressive politicians, stems from dysregulated empathy.
Right. Well, I look forward to that. But I mean, another thing that you allude to is this solidarity that one gets from belonging to a community that shares the same religious faith, I suppose you could call it. And so it seems like if you're a researcher or an academic, at some point there's going to be a tension between your group affiliation and your desire to signal to your group that you are a loyal member of that group and your pursuit of truth. And, you know, religious people, I think traditionally we've had enough centuries of religion and science coexisting that with traditional religions, I've met plenty of very, very religious scientists who have the ability to sort of just put in a box their religion and do like fantastic scientific research. Is it perhaps that this new religion is just so fresh that they haven't figured out how to put it in its box yet?
It is. Of course, there are many elements of the parasitic ideological rapture that is akin to your point of a secular religion, right? There are revealed truths that are impervious to falsification, right? Literally. So there are very, very clear epistemological analogies that you could draw from religion and these quasi kind of woke parasitic religions. So to that point, you're exactly right.
You can be a Christian geologist, but the claim that the world was created 4,000 years ago, that particular piece of your Christian faith, you've deleted that. That part you've deleted.
I call that cafeteria religion, right? You go to the buffet of cafeteria and you pick the ones that you think that's exactly what happens, for example, with a lot of Islamic people that I chat with, right? We say, oh, but that's not true. Well, no, it is true what I'm telling you about codified canonical Jew hatred. You choose to ignore that part, right? There isn't a form of Judaism that I practice whereby eating shrimp and pork is okay. I don't practice light Judaism. I simply ignore the parts, culinarily speaking, that I don't wish. But Judaism is Judaism. It exists independently of what my practice in cafeteria Judaism is. So that you're exactly right. But your earlier point about how you're part of a group and you have your identity and you don't necessarily want to speak out of this identity. Of course, scientists suffer from that. But Solomon Asch experiment already explained that to us, right? I always tell my students when we come into class, there's a couple of classic experiments that are perfect to discuss for several reasons. One of which is that you don't have to have convoluted experimental designs in order to prove something that is unbelievably profound about the human spirit. So the Solomon Asch experiment is very simple. I won't get into all the details, but you show people 3 lines of varying length, but that it's so clear how different they are that a legally blind person could tell. And then you show another line that is the same length as one of those 3 other ones, so that it should be absolutely clear that it's line B that's the same as line X. But what you want to do in the experiment is you want to see what happens to people if they are presented with other people that are giving the wrong answer. Will they acquiesce to what clearly is a wrong answer? Their lying eyes are deceiving them. Or will they look and say, are you insane? That you're giving a wrong answer. What, you're a moron? And of course, the brilliance of Solomon Asch experiment is that a disheartening number of people, if it were one person, you wouldn't believe it, but it's a lot more than one person. They just nod their head and give the exact same wrong answer, knowing full well that can't be the right answer. But there's nothing scarier than me standing out in the group. And it's literally, when you ask people, what is your biggest fear? People are more afraid of public speaking than death. That's literally true, right? So it's not the natural reflex for most people to defend truth if it will ostracize me from the group. And to your point about finding the fitness maximization, there are clear evolutionary reasons why I should stick in the group, right? By the way, there's a great book, which I'm almost starting to feel upset that I'm giving it so much free publicity. I should be getting royalties from their book. The book is called The Enigma of Reason. Absolutely.
Yeah, I've had Hugo Mercier on the show.
Oh, so have I. Did you enjoy it?
It's fantastic. And also in the business of selling his books too.
Exactly. And so what Hugo Mercier and Dan Sperber argued is that the faculty of reasoning in humans did not evolve to seek some objective truth, but rather it evolved to win arguments, right? I loved Elon Musk, but now he's no longer on my team. It doesn't matter if he now cures cancer. He's a bad Nazi. And so now, the reason why I wanted to put that in chapter 7 of The Parasitic Mind is because I wanted to be fully honest in the difficulty of seeking truth. Here I am offering you in chapter 7 an epistemological tool for seeking truth, but I'm also telling you that the problem with my mind vaccine is that most people go, la, 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 I don't want to hear it. I'm not having your mind vaccine. And so that becomes a challenge. How can I get you to change your opinion if I know that there is probably nothing I'm going to say that's going to move you 1 millimeter off your anchored position?
Well, look, last question. In your book, in The Parasitic Mind, you spend a lot of time talking about the parasites that are most common in academia, right? And I think you have a lot of critics on Twitter. I'm not a big Twitter guy or X guy, but I know you are huge on social media. And a lot of people have criticized you for offering up an unbalanced approach. Now, I'm probably one of the few people at UC Berkeley that actually has friends who voted for Trump. And I can say that the mind parasites, they don't discriminate. They are equally represented on both sides. Do you anticipate maybe looking into the mind parasites of that other side, or is there enough research being done by so many of our academic colleagues that you don't need to do that?
No, that's a great question. I actually addressed that very early in the book, where I exactly predicted that could be a concern. And with full transparency, I said, look, it is clear that the capacity to be parasitized transcends time periods, transcends cultures, transcends political aisles. I will be focusing on specific set of parasitic ideas that emanate from academia. And as it so happens, since academia is astonishingly leftist, those parasitic ideas happen to be originating, their genesis is from the left. That doesn't mean that people on the right can't be parasitized. And I give a specific example of what I just said from evolutionary theory. So resistance to evolution is much more likely to come from the right. Resistance to evolutionary psychology is much more likely to come to the left. That exactly proves the point that you are asking. But in the same way that you don't go see diabetes physician and say, wait a second, are you saying that melanoma is not important, diabetes doctor? He looks at you and says, you're a moron. Yes, it is important, but I specialize in diabetes. So the fact that I specialize in parasitic ideas of the left because I am a man of academia where all the left rules doesn't mean that people on the right can't be abject morons also.
Well, we will at some point have a general science of mind virus epidemiology, and you'll be part of that group. So maybe since you've agreed to come back another time, we can talk about particularly what business schools can do and what people in academia can do to help resist infection. And so until then, thank you so much, Gad, for joining me. I really appreciate it, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you so much, Greg. I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to the Unsiloed podcast produced by University FM. If you enjoyed today's episode, please give us a 5-star rating and review in your favorite listening app. To listen to our other episodes, please visit our website at www.unsiloedpodcast.com.